Houston, Texas, night of July 23rd, 2016. The highway lights cut through the darkness, and the Sunshine Motel, with its simple facade and flashing neon, stood out as a stopping point for those seeking anonymity. It was a common place for couples who wanted to escape the routine, but it also attracted those who preferred to keep secrets. Among the customers who came in that night, no one caught the eye more than Sarah Thompson and Derek Miller. They arrived together in a black sedan, with the windows rolled up and the radio turned on low, almost as if they were trying to keep the world from noticing their presence. The clock said 10 p.m. Sarah, 28, was an attractive young woman with long brown hair that fell in soft curls over her shoulders. She worked as an administrative assistant in a downtown office. Derek, on the other hand, was a 35-year-old man with a seemingly calm appearance, but there was something dark in his eyes. He worked as a truck driver and spent long hours on the road. Their combination seemed, at first glance, something common. But anyone who paid attention to Sarah's expression when she entered the motel would see that something was wrong. They passed through reception with few words exchanged. Tim, the attendant, noticed the tense way Sarah held her back, as if she was seeking reassurance from it. Derek, on the other hand, was impassive. His serious face and steady steps made it clear he was in control. "I didn't think it was anything alarming," Tim would later recall, but looking back, you could tell she was nervous. They were assigned to room 203 on the second floor, one of the most discreet and isolated rooms in the place. It was the kind of accommodation people chose when they didn't want to be bothered, or when they wanted to avoid questions. The room was simple: a double bed, an old television, heavy curtains, and a small bathtub in the bathroom, which would soon become the scene of something much more sinister. As Sarah climbed the stairs after Derek, something in her eyes revealed fear. She seemed to hesitate with every step, almost as if she knew that entering that room would be a point of no return. When they reached the door, Derek opened it firmly, and she entered right behind, like a shadow, swallowed by the darkness that awaited them. The following hours would be a mixture of silence and growing tension. The motel, on the outside, maintained its normal routine. Couples coming and going, doors opening and closing, the distant sound of cars passing on the highway. But inside room 203, the atmosphere was different. Sarah and Derek barely exchanged words. The car radio had been turned off, but the silence between them was deafening. That July night, the temperature outside the room was around 30 degrees, but the climate inside the four walls was much colder. For Sarah, time seemed to drag by, as if every minute brought her closer to a destination she feared, but didn't know exactly what it would be. As the city lights flickered in the distance, no one could imagine what was about to happen. The Sunshine Motel would be the last place Sarah Thompson would be seen alive. It was around 11 p.m. when the first sounds of arguing began to echo through room 203. The Sunshine Motel, with its thin walls and narrow hallways, made any noise spread easily. Guests in neighboring rooms began to hear what sounded like a heated fight. For anyone passing through the hallways, it was impossible not to notice the raised voices coming from behind that door. At first, the screams were muffled. There were intense whispers, discussions typical of a couple. Derek spoke in a harsh, authoritative tone. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed to be trying to defuse the situation, her voice low and hesitant, almost as if she was begging him to stop. The two had already argued other times, but something that night was different. There was a tension in the air, a kind of desperation that made everything darker. A few minutes later, the screams intensified. Now they were audible enough that the guests in the next room, a couple who were also there for the night, began to worry. The couple's wife commented to her partner, "This doesn't look good. Should we do something?" But as was typical in motels like this, no one wanted to get involved in problems that didn't directly involve them. Inside the room, things were getting out of control. The fight, which started for seemingly trivial reasons, quickly escalated. Derek was distraught, driven by jealousy and anger that had been building for weeks. He accused Sarah of betrayal, of lies, of things she never did. To him, any look she gave another man was a threat. At that moment, his paranoia had reached boiling point. Sarah, in turn, was on the verge of collapse. She had tried to end the relationship several times, but always backed away out of fear. Derek was not an easy man to deal with. He was controlled by anger, by unfounded suspicions, and Sarah knew that leaving that relationship could be dangerous. And that night, she felt that danger had finally materialized. The argument soon turned into something physical. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the room as Derek, in a moment of rage, threw a glass against the wall. Shards of glass flew across the floor, and Sarah backed away, her shaking hands raised in a protective gesture. "Stop. Please, Derek, let's talk," she screamed, her voice cracking with fear. But Derek wasn't listening anymore. He had crossed the line between anger and violence. His eyes were fixed on her with frightening intensity, and the room that had once seemed cramped now became a prison. Sarah tried to move away, heading towards the door, but Derek was faster. He held her arm tightly, preventing her from leaving. "Do you think you can leave me? After everything I did for you?" Derek growled, his face inches from hers. Sarah tried to free herself, but he pushed her back, causing her to stumble and fall to the ground. The impact left her stunned for a few seconds, long enough for Derek to approach again, this time with a much darker intention. She knew she needed to get out of there, but there was no way. The room was small, the door was blocked by Derek, and the only other exit was the small window, which was locked and far away. Desperate, Sarah crawled backwards until she reached the bathroom. The bathtub, which she had filled earlier in hopes of relaxing, now seemed a symbol of what was to come. The bathroom door slammed shut as Sarah locked herself inside. She breathed hard, her heart racing, trying to think of a way out. The sound of his own sobs seemed to fill the small space, but outside, Derek's fury was uncontrollable. He was banging on the door with all his might, shouting her name, demanding she open it. The motel was quiet, but the chaos inside room 203 was deafening. "Sarah, open that damn door." Derek screamed, his voice filled with an anger that seemed to have no end. He punched the wood, and the sound echoed throughout the room. Sarah, sitting on the cold bathroom floor, was desperately trying to find a way to calm down and think rationally. She knew she couldn't stay there forever, and she knew that eventually Derek would make it inside. Fear tightened her chest, and she looked around, as if the answer to her escape was hidden within the bathroom walls. The bathtub, still full of warm water, reflected the dim light from the ceiling. The towel she had left on the counter earlier was lying on the floor, as if already anticipating the disaster that was about to happen. Outside, the sound of Derek trying to break down the door grew louder. Sarah knew time was running out. Suddenly, the door gave way. With a crash, Derek entered the bathroom, his expression that of a man consumed by a blind rage. Sarah screamed, but the sound seemed to be lost in the echo of the room. She tried to get up, but before she could react, Derek was on top of her. He grabbed her arms tightly, dragging her to the edge of the bathtub. Sarah struggled, her screams of despair filling the bathroom as she tried to free herself, but Derek was stronger. His anger seemed amplified, as if Sarah's every attempt at resistance only increased his fury. "You'll never leave me, Sarah," he growled, pushing her into the bathtub. The impact was brutal. Water splashed out, wetting the floor and walls. Sarah, now submerged, tried to get up, but Derek held her by the shoulders, forcing her head down. The water, which had previously seemed warm, was now a death trap. Sarah fought with all her might, her hands trying to grab anything, Derek's arm, the sides of the bathtub, anything that could save her. But the desperation in his eyes found no mercy in Derek. Their screams were muffled by the water, and their once frantic movements began to weaken. The force of gravity and Derek's weight kept his body pinned to the bottom of the bathtub. The once crystal clear water now churned as Sarah fought for her life. But little by little, the fight dissipated. The bubbles rising to the surface of the water began to subside until everything was dead silent. Derek still held her head, even when she no longer moved. For a few seconds, silence dominated the environment. Derek stood there, still panting, looking at the bathtub. The water was still, and Sarah didn't move. He took a few steps back, as if absorbing what he had just done. His eyes were fixed on Sarah's motionless body, now submerged in the bathtub. The reflection of the lamp gently swaying from the ceiling made the scene seem even more surreal. Derek came out of the bathroom, staggering to the edge of the bed. He sat up, hands shaking as he tried to understand what had just happened. The summer heat seemed not to penetrate that room. Everything was cold, still. The sound of the air conditioning, which previously went unnoticed, was now deafening in the silence of the tragedy. For a moment, Derek stood there, looking at the floor, not knowing what to do. He had never planned for things to get this far. The argument, the anger, everything seemed to have slipped out of his hands. But now it was too late. Sarah was dead, drowned in the bathtub of a cheap motel, and he was responsible. Derek looked towards the bathroom, Sarah's body still submerged. The reality of what he had done finally hit him like a punch in the gut. Fear began to creep into his mind, and he knew he needed to act quickly. It was a matter of time before someone discovered the body, and he couldn't be caught there. Without thinking much, Derek quickly got up and started looking for her wallet. He went through Sarah's bag, taking out her cell phone, cards, and money. Adrenaline took over his every movement. Afterwards, he went to the bathroom one last time, looking at Sarah's lifeless body, and left room 203, leaving behind what would be the scene of a brutal crime. The next morning, the Sunshine Motel remained in its usual routine of discreet service and silence in the hallways. It was 10 a.m. when the maid, a middle-aged woman named Linda, started cleaning the rooms. The summer heat made work more tiring, and she was eager to finish her shift. When he arrived at room 203, he was surprised that the door was ajar. Linda knocked lightly, waiting to hear a response. Nothing. He tried again, but the silence inside the room felt heavy, almost oppressive. She hesitated for a second, remembering complaints from other guests the night before about a fight that had taken place in that very room. With a shiver running up her spine, she slowly pushed the door open. The first thing she noticed was the still, stuffy air. The curtains were closed, leaving the room dimly lit, with a gloom that made the atmosphere even more strange. The clothes were thrown on the floor, the mattress was turned over, as if something violent had happened there. But what caught Linda's attention most was the sound. A soft, steady drip came from the bathroom, breaking the silence. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Linda asked, her voice shaking. No response. With shaking hands, she approached the bathroom door. Each step felt like a challenge, as if something in her instinct was warning her not to continue. But duty spoke louder, and, pushing open the bathroom door, what she saw made her recoil instantly, her heart pounding in her chest. The scene unfolding before her eyes was the last thing Linda expected. Sarah lay in the bathtub, her skin pale and submerged in the now cloudy water. Sarah's hair floated almost fancifully on the surface of the water, but her face was turned down, motionless. The water, which now had a slightly pinkish hue, reflected the dim light from the ceiling, giving the room an eerie glow. The dripping that Linda had heard earlier came from the poorly closed tap, completing the macabre scene. Linda screamed, a sharp, desperate sound that echoed through the hallway. Panicking, she ran out of the room, tripping over her feet as she tried to call for help. The motel manager, a middle-aged man with an expression of constant boredom, came running when he heard Linda's screams. Seeing the look of terror on her face, he knew something terrible had happened. The police were called immediately. In less than an hour, the Sunshine Motel was surrounded by patrol cars and yellow tape. Detectives and forensic experts were in and out of room 203, trying to understand what had happened that fateful night. The small motel, normally a discreet spot for furtive trysts, was now the center of a brutal crime. The lead detective on the case, Jack Stevens, an experienced man with years of service in violent crimes, entered the room with a grim expression. He had seen scenes like this before, but it was never easy. The heavy atmosphere in the room seemed to suffocate everyone who entered, as if the violence of that night was still embedded in the walls. When Jack entered the bathroom, Sarah's body had already been removed by the coroners, but the signs of the crime were still there. The bathtub, the pink water, the fragments of glass scattered across the floor, everything pointed to a violent fight that had ended in tragedy. While the forensics team photographed and collected evidence, Jack began analyzing the scene. Apparently, Sarah had been drowned, but not without a fight. The room was ransacked, clear signs that a fierce struggle took place before his death. The bathroom mirror was broken, and desperate handprints could be seen on the edges of the bathtub, indicating that Sarah had tried to hold on to anything while being subdued. The first testimonials from guests also began to arrive. Many reported hearing screams the night before, but no one wanted to get involved. "It looked like a couple fighting," said one of the roommates. "We thought they would calm down, as they always do." This indifference now left a feeling of guilt in everyone who listened but did not act. The motel manager, although concerned, was unable to provide much information. He mentioned that the couple arrived late in the afternoon, paid in cash, and gave no indication that anything was wrong. Derek, who had fled after the crime, left no easy trail to follow. Sarah's documents were still in the room, but there was no sign of her cards or cell phone. When searching the security cameras, the police found what they needed. The images showed Derek leaving the room at around 3 a.m., alone and in a hurry. He wore a hood, trying to avoid cameras, but it wasn't enough to hide his identity. Jack knew that time was now crucial. They had a killer on the loose, and every minute wasted could be the difference between capturing him or letting him escape forever. The hunt for Derek had begun. With footage of Derek rushing out of room 203 in hand, the Chicago Police Department knew they were dealing with a critical situation. The clock was now the biggest enemy. Every second that passed was a chance for Derek to escape further, and the investigation team needed to act quickly. Detective Jack Stevens, a veteran of murder cases, had seen fugitives like Derek before, men who, in the heat of anger, crossed a line from which they could never return. The team quickly placed an alert at all exit points in the city. Bus stations, airports, and train stations were notified, but Derek didn't seem like the type to plan an organized escape. He had acted on impulse, and now he was racing against his own panic. Jack knew Derek would make mistakes. He just needed to be ready to act as soon as they appeared. At the monitoring center, investigators began to trace Derek's steps after escaping from the motel. He had left the place on foot, taking a route that took him through a series of deserted streets in the early hours of the morning. Security cameras showed a man hurrying, with his head down, crossing residential neighborhoods towards the city center. There was tension in the air. The adrenaline of the escape was palpable, even in the images. Investigations revealed the basics about Derek. He was a man with a history of anger management issues and had a history of domestic violence. Sarah, the victim, had been his girlfriend for just over a year. The relationship, according to friends and family, was unstable, marked by constant fights and controlling behavior on Derek's part. Detective Jack knew he was dealing with a man who was dangerous, not only to others, but also to himself. The fear of being captured could push him to even more desperate acts. As the team worked to track Derek's every move, an urgent call came into the police station. A taxi driver, identified only as Paul, reported taking a man matching Derek's description to a neighborhood in the city's south end in the early hours of the morning. Paul mentioned that the passenger was restless, always looking over their shoulder and repeatedly asking if anyone was following them. Although Derek had left the taxi in a remote neighborhood, this was the first concrete lead the team had. Jack and his team quickly moved to the area. The neighborhood where Derek had been left was a rundown area, full of abandoned buildings and poorly lit streets. It was the perfect kind of place for someone to hide temporarily, but Jack knew Derek couldn't stay there forever. He was running, but without a plan. "We need to set up a perimeter," Jack ordered, coordinating with local police to cordon off the area. With the neighborhoods full of alleys and abandoned buildings, finding Derek would not be an easy task. But Jack knew Derek was panicking, and someone in a panic always ends up being reckless. The agents began searching every alley, every building, talking to residents, trying to find anything that would indicate where Derek might be. The tension was rising. Jack knew that Derek was increasingly cornered, and that made him unpredictable. He could try to escape again, or worse, he could react violently if he felt he had no other option. It was then that, in the early afternoon, a young man who lived in one of the old buildings reported seeing someone enter one of the abandoned apartments. He seemed nervous, sweaty, and rushed into the building without looking back, said the boy. Jack immediately mobilized his team. It was time to act. Carefully, the elite SWAT team surrounded the building. Jack, following everything closely, observed the place as the agents prepared for the invasion. There was tension in the air, the feeling that the hunt was about to end, but no one knew how Derek would react. "Derek, we know you're in there. Come out with your hands up, and no one will get hurt," one of the negotiators shouted through a megaphone. The building remained silent. The minutes seemed to drag by as police waited for any signs of life inside. Suddenly, the sound of a window breaking echoed through the place. Derek, in an act of desperation, tried to escape through the roof of the building. He had climbed a fire escape, but his escape was quickly cut short when a team of police officers spotted him. "There he is," shouted one of the agents. Derek was running across the roof, stumbling over the rubble and looking for a way out. The panic in his eyes was evident. He knew he was surrounded. There was nowhere else to go. Jack, watching the scene from below, grabbed the radio and ordered the officers to remain calm. Derek was on the verge of collapse, and any rash move could end badly. "Derek, there's nowhere to run. Get down now and give yourself up," shouted Jack, his voice firm and authoritative. For a moment, Derek hesitated. He looked around, seeing police officers on every corner of the roof, ready to act. His breathing was heavy, and sweat was running down his face. He knew it was all over. But the fear of facing the consequences of what he had done dominated him. Finally, after a few minutes of agonizing silence, Derek dropped what he was holding and raised his hands. "I didn't want it to end like this," he muttered, as the officers slowly approached, placing the handcuffs on his wrists. The hunt was over. Jack watched as Derek was taken away, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The case that had begun with a violent fight in a motel room now came to an end with the capture of a man who had lost everything: his freedom, his future, and Sarah's life. Justice began there, but the scars of this crime would remain forever.